Orion Taraban, is that you?
That's me. Hi, Sean. Thanks for
Hi.
having me on, man.
Yeah, good to see you, buddy. So this has been a long time coming. We've been talking about this for a bit, and I'm a little bit late to the party. But the reason we're talking today is you have a book
Hey,
called
you got the book.
The Value of
I
Others.
got the same book over here. Look at
Oh,
that.
we can make bookends out of them. Um, the Value of Others. And on the back cover, it says that you are putting forth an economic model of relationships, which is a really interesting thing because as I was looking through this, well, not looking through it, as I was reading it, it occurred to me, the question occurred to me that how do we as psychologists do on this topic of the transactional nature of relationships? And so every relationship has layers to it. One of those layers is the transactional layer. I'm giving you something, I'm getting something in return. And this book is really a focus on the transactional side of relationships. So I guess my first question for you is what prompted you to look at relationships from an economic perspective? And were there any economists that influenced your thinking?
Sure. The second question is easy to answer. Von Mises really influenced my thinking. I read his masterpiece, Human Action, a few years ago. That is a banger, man. Like every single page, I was just like, yes, this guy gets it. He was able to put so many truths about reality so clearly and so succinctly on the page that it just made me happy. It was like one of those books that I couldn't even stay in my chair to read it. So von Mises and his Austrian School of Economics has heavily influenced the economic dimension of my theory of relationships.
In
But
what
to,
sense?
um, well, to understand that when you go far beyond what economics is associated in the imagination to the vast majority of people. First of all, economics is not about money. It's about the study of how people make decisions using scarce means to very definite and intentional ends that could be applied in other ways. So that's one thing. So approaching economics from the perspective of the study of decision making, which people obviously do when they choose who to enter into relationships and whether to stay in those relationships. And so understand that classical economics is insufficient to explain the vast majority of decision making behavior. Like you can't just explain why people make decisions based on like the law of scarcity. That obviously it seems that rarer things tend to be more valuable at that moment, but it's more than just supply and demand that manipulates market forces. And so von Mises becomes much more nuanced with his thinking with respect to these classical principles and evolves them to the point where they fit better with my perception of reality. Like one of the enduring concepts from his school is the law of marginal utility. Have you heard about that? I
Tell me
talk
about
about
that.
it briefly in the book. The law of marginal utility is functionally that um, commodities become less valuable in the act of acquiring them. So it's like if you're very hungry, a steak dinner sounds really good, but that doesn't necessarily, and you might be willing to pay a lot of money because it's going to be delicious. It's going to solve your hunger problem, but you're probably not going to pay as much for the second steak, let alone the 20th steak. You might pay to get rid of the 20th steak at that point. So the 20th steak isn't as valuable to the first steak to the hungry individual. So the value of something to any given person changes in the act of acquiring it, which is a very salient idea with respect to relationships. As I talk about in the first chapter, it's like no one continues to pay the plumber. That's the kind of line. Like when people have a problem with their plumbing, a plumber is in very high demand and they might be willing to pay top dollar for his services. But once the clog has been cleared, you don't continue to pay that guy, right? The value of him for your life has just precipitously declined, and it declined as a function of him giving you what you wanted. Now, that has, I think, a clear analog to, let's say, the difficulty of maintaining relationships is sometimes the perceived value of another person declines as a function of them giving us what we want. And so if that's the case, how do you maintain high levels of desire, value, and attraction in relationships long term? It's actually very difficult to do that, as we can see by the success rates.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, we can come back to the success rates. I want to jump back to that, but on the economic question, I had a similar reaction when I read Thomas Sowell's Basic Economics, which sounds like the most boring book on the planet, but I came out of it thinking this is a book on psychology because it's about decision making. It's about weighing trade-offs and exploring unintended consequences and being able to look a little ways down the road when you're making decisions. It's very much a psychology book, and so you have taken this economic realm and you've applied it to relationships. And I wonder, so one of the themes through your book, I think, is that, and correct me if I don't have this right, but that there are some motivations that most people have to not discuss the transactional side of the relationship. Am I getting that right?
Sure. I had an episode that just came out called Saying the Quiet Part Loud. And this is a function not just of romantic relationships, but of all kinds of relationships. I talk about that in any game, there are rules and laws. And one of the rules of most relationships is that you can't talk about the core transaction at the heart of the relationship. And that's especially true with romantic relationships. But because that's difficult for a lot of people to approach directly, let's do it as an analogy through professional relationships. The core transaction at the heart of professional relationships is I'm exchanging my time and labor for money. Like if you have that exchange, you have a professional relationship. If you don't have that exchange, you don't have a professional relationship. It is the necessary and sufficient condition of a professional relationship. That said, even though everybody is working for money, it's kind of gauche to be too direct and explicit about that. That's why, I mean, if it were more direct, job interviews wouldn't take very long at all. It's like, what service do you provide? How much are you going to pay? Okay, sounds like we can move forward. But there's a lot of other stuff that goes into it about the culture of the company and the mission of the organization and the community and goodness of fit. All those things are salient to a point, but they're often used to protect the dignity of the individuals involved so people don't feel too much like prostitutes for just selling their time for money, or uh, or on the other hand, that they're purchasing a substantial part of human beings' lives just for a little bit of profit. Do you understand?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's even in professional relationships where everybody knows that the transaction of money is the essential component. We don't really talk about it that explicitly. Now, if we seem to be shy about discussing the core transaction in professional relationships, we are very touchy about discussing the core transaction at the heart of sexual relationships, which I think is the transaction of sex for resources. Resources very broadly defined. It's not just about money. It's about attention, commitment, security, excitement, lifestyle, provision, protection, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
And
let me throw in an anecdote there to build on your point about not discussing the pay for time equation in relationships. I have a friend who is high level manager slash clinician in a particular realm, and he supervises people with terminal degrees. So these are people with PhDs doing very technical work. So these people are obviously committed to the type of work that they're doing. They have some interest beyond, I just need a paycheck. This organization is doing layoffs, and HR, human resources, has instructed my friend, the manager, that when he's discussing either layoffs or I guess the other piece of it is salary caps, they're capping these people's salary when many of them could go out into the marketplace and make much more than what they're making at this place. So they're capping salaries. And as my manager friend is talking to them about his supervisees about salary caps, one of the things that he has been instructed to say by HR is, well, Joe, there are many reasons for coming to work. There's the satisfaction that you get, and there's the teamwork, and yada, yada, yada. And all of that becomes absolutely laughable when the organization on the other side is saying, but we're not going to pay you. they're undercutting their own message by saying you have lots of reasons for coming to work, but we don't have lots of reasons for paying you to come to work. And my friend finds it absolutely insulting that he is to talk about all these non-tangible reasons for coming to work while he is telling people we're not going to pay you very much.
Absolutely. But you understand that HR, of course, had to advise your colleague to do that
Mhm.
because, in the absence of paying people well, if he just said, yeah, we don't really have much else to offer, that person is definitely going to be bolting for the door. But it's possible that that person might buy the bullshit and
Mhm.
say, yeah, you're right. Maybe that 10% pay cut can be compensated by the fact that we do have ping pong tables here. We do company picnics quarterly, that I do get a share at the meetings to feel impactful in the organization. Maybe that's worth 20 grand a year. Probably not, but like that's the sleight of hand that's going on in that conversation.
Right.
And that's
It is a
also,
sleight of hand.
it is a sleight of hand. And that also speaks to romantic relationships because, just like in this situation, the less you give people what they want, in this case, giving the employee money, the more you have to compensate them or attempt to compensate them in other ways that aren't nearly as satisfying and fulfilling. So, with respect to sexual relationships, the less that you can give the other person what they truly want, the more you're going to have to compensate them or attempt to compensate them with a whole bunch of other bullshit. So, what people generally want at the highest level is an authentic connection with somebody who loves them, that is at their level, that excites them. A lot of this stuff that they want is actually more emotional and psychological than just material. That's why
Mhm.
people sometimes bristle at the economic model. They take it too literally. And if they don't get that from an attractive individual, if they don't get that authentic connection, then the other stuff, the material stuff, definitely becomes more important. They definitely need a house. They definitely need the marriage contract. They definitely need the ring. They definitely need the label. They definitely need all this other stuff. But if they were compensated with that authentic connection with somebody that they highly desire, that's like getting paid more money in a professional environment. And they're less likely to worry about or care about some of that other compensatory bullshit.
When I was reading through your book, I was trying to think of groups or people that I think are good at being in a relationship that is not purely about exchange of money or whatever, but are also good at talking about the transactional side. And I came up with a couple of groups in the romantic realm that,
Oh, yeah?
well, came up with a couple of groups that I think are pretty good at talking about the transactional side. But before I even ask that question or tell you what I noticed, why is it important to is it important and why is it important to know about the transactional realm side of the relationship or to discuss it with the other person?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, the fundamental thesis of the book is that everyone is trying to get and keep their perceived best option. And if that's true, that means that the perception of value, perceived best, is at the heart of all human relationships. Perception is psychological, value is economic. You need both. And the problem with the vast majority of relationship advice is it tends to focus exclusively on one or the other. And in general, our culture really over prioritizes the psychological dimension, which is basically like it's what's on the inside that counts. Just be a good person, like understand your attachment style, learn how to be an effective communicator. It's like everything is intrapsychic. It's like become the person that you want to attract. Do you understand? Which is sounds good, but is actually not very good advice, especially for successful women as they're finding out. Like they might want to attract a successful, high powered man, but it takes a great deal of time to become a successful woman. And by the time they become a successful man, i.e., they become what they want to attract, those successful men might want younger, more attractive women, right? So becoming what you want to attract is generally not a good idea. Like, Sean, you don't seem like you're a very feminine guy, but I imagine that you want a feminine woman. You understand? So becoming what you want to attract sounds good, but it actually doesn't make a lot of sense.
Actually,
In any
I
case,
wrote down a quote. I copied and pasted a quote from your book along those lines. So you wrote, "A captain cannot remain a captain if he's a passenger." I want to come back to the nautical imagery because there's a lot of nautical imagery in the book. But he can't remain a captain if he's a passenger. If she succeeds, meaning the female part of half of a relationship, succeeds in luring a male captain off his boat, female captains can inadvertently destroy the basis of their own attraction by turning a daring leader into a devoted follower. They lose by getting what they want. Sort of what you're just saying.
yeah, it's similar to that. In general, though, most male captains aren't going to be willing to go in for that. Like, and we talk about that in the end of chapter 2 when I discuss the two body problem, which is that it takes 10 to 15 years to ascend to one's captaincy, to build a boat, learn to sail, and plot a course. And once a person invests in that considerable time consuming process, they're very unlikely to give that up for a trifle.
Mm-hmm.
They're very unlikely to work for 15 years only to become a passenger on somebody else's vessel. So it's unlikely to happen. But if for whatever reason there's a soft-hearted, successful male captain who is lured off his ship, well, the woman might temporarily be satisfied with her victory, that she is the one in charge, she's in control, and she got the man that she wanted. Well, in the process of taking him off his boat, what she ends up attaining is not what she was initially attracted to, which is the daring, confident captain who was braving the high seas. And now she's going to feel swindled in the sense that the man is no longer who she once was attracted to. And of course, the man was complicit in that transformation.
Yeah.
And that's not the basis of an enduring relationship. That relationship is probably already in jeopardy.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we've both seen guys who, in their effort to be agreeable and accommodating, they turn into someone that the woman was not attracted to.
Sure.
They transform themselves from the person that she was attracted to.
But to get back to it, we need the psychological and the economic to truly understand relationships. If it's all psychological, if it's all just what's on the inside that counts, then why don't good people have more relationship opportunities?
That's a good question.
Like, why aren't women hanging out around orphanages? Why aren't women hanging out outside of soup kitchens where good people are volunteering their time for the underprivileged? It's like that's not where women are lining up to try to capture men. Virtue is not sexy. Virtue has to be its own reward. It doesn't get you laid. It doesn't make you money.
Where do
it just
they
makes you
line up?
good.
There's a million guys out there that want to know, where do they line up?
They line up in many different places, but they line up for men who have fame. Like, fame is by far the greatest emotional catalyst for women's attraction. And generally, fame occurs when a man consistently demonstrates visible competence in his domain of expertise, whether he's an athlete or a rock star or a psychologist. It's like anybody who's very publicly good at what he does, with a little luck, will eventually attract a following. And that following makes that person more attractive by an order of magnitude than he would otherwise be if people didn't understand the context in which he was embedded. And that's where women are lining up.
I agree with that. I would add to it also that, particularly with younger women, they tend to also line up for potential. And when they see qualities in a man that suggest that he has the capability to succeed in the world and the willingness to stick around and invest in a relationship, like
potential is difficult. I found that women don't invest in potential probably as often as they should.
Right.
I made an episode that was directed towards women called Ladies Find Your Dark Horse, which is that if you wait until the race has been run and you try to attract the attention of the victor, you're probably going to be unsuccessful because hundreds of other women have had the same idea. Mm-hmm. And you have to have a very honest look with the woman in the mirror. Could I beat out 100 other women for this man's attention and commitment? And by definition, 99% of those women will have to say no. So that's not a viable strategy for a lot of women if they're looking for a committed relationship with a successful man. It's better to try to place your bets before the race is run, but that means you have to kind of understand something about horses. You have to understand what what the horse's teeth mean, how to measure it in hands, understanding its previous victories. You have to learn about horses to be able to make a reasonable guess on how it's going to perform in the race that is yet to be run. And
So
most
if I
women don't want to
understand you
do that.
correctly, you're saying that a woman should inspect a man's teeth.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very strong. High calcium. It means he's probably going to be sturdy, right?
Yeah. Well, the good news is that in evolutionary psychology, there is some good evidence that women, if they're not tainted by other influences, that they do tend to assess potential and qualities. Because if women only, what's the line that rattles around the manosphere, that women
hang out
don't
at the
care about
finish
men's
line
strength, they
and
hang out
choose the winners.
If that were true, then only guys in their 50s with money like me would have women. It's not true.
It's true.
Young guys who are not wealthy, who have not yet succeeded, most of them do fine if they display qualities.
Well, I'm not going to say that that's not true, Sean, but we also need to be clear about which potential qualities are more important in the selection process, because they're not equally important. And I think when women do pursue this strategy, the qualities that they're most interested in seeing in a man as a potential mate are like ambition and industriousness and conscientiousness, effort, delay of gratification, because all of those traits or qualities are directly related to the capacity to succeed.
Yes, and the other side, that at least evolutionary psychology says, that is one that is tremendously important, a quality that women look for, and the other that they look for is a willingness to stick around, a willingness to invest, which goes against a lot of what the common knowledge that's out there. But women do tend to assess men for kindness, for humor, for their connection to other people, their network. So there's those two big variables.
I hear you, but the first one definitely comes first.
The second one doesn't count if the first one's not there.
Exactly. Yeah. But you're right. Some women forget the second part, which is that a successful man is only of use to her if he's willing to share his success.
Right.
And some guys aren't going to be willing to do that.
Yeah.
But there's plenty of guys, myself included, when I was in my early 20s, who were very willing to share, but didn't have much. And that consistently gets passed over by the vast majority of women.
Yeah. The smart ones, they pick up on it. My wife did okay.
Very good, man. I'm glad it worked out for you.
So
we want to get into the perception, the psychology, and the value, the economics. And I wrote this book because I think a lot of relationship advice is at best half right, which is all wrong. Like I said, the majority is too psychological. Work on yourself, learn to communicate. It's all about the inside. Be what you want to attract. Okay. But if that were true, then good, virtuous men and women would be more successful at attracting and keeping sexual partners and long-term mates. And that's not what we see. By the other token, there is a smaller contingent of advice that focuses more on the economic principles, which has to do with attraction, which is basically all you got to be is attractive, man. Get a 6-pack, get a nice car, get a good suit, take care of yourself, learn game. All that shit is important. If you do those things, you're going to have more options, regardless of whether you're a good person or not. It's going to be potentially more difficult to keep people around or to attract and maintain relationships with high quality individuals. But if you're attractive enough as a man or a woman, people will fight for the opportunity to give you a chance. And they will stick around longer to make a relationship work than they would otherwise. So the issue is that it's actually very hard to be both, right, Sean? It's very hard to be a good person, and it's very hard to be an attractive person. And generally, when people think that they're good, they feel like they don't have to be attractive. And that's kind of a lot of the pushback that I get. Orion is so superficial. He's so materialistic. that kind of stuff is just for gold diggers and fuckboys, and no one should care about that stuff. It's the purity of the heart, it's the feeling, it's the inner dimension, that all that's important. Whereas the people who are attractive, sometimes they don't think they have to be good. And they think, I, yeah, I could be crazy. I could be very high maintenance and difficult, but men kind of like the challenge. And if it's not this guy, I know that some other guy would be happy to buy me a drink. So, and that's infuriating to people too, right?
Mhm.
The issue is that it's very hard to be both. It takes so much time and energy and effort to be even one of those two things, let alone both. But we need ideally to be both good and attractive. But if you have to choose, it's actually better to be attractive, at least in terms of the sexual marketplace.
In terms
Because
of the
again,
sexual marketplace.
attractive people will have options.
It's true. Is it important for, I mean, should people be more forthright about the transactional side of the relationship? You're sitting at dinner with on a first date, and should you be upfront about the fact that, yeah, I'm going to provide value, you're going to provide sex, this is what we're here for?
No,
Why?
because that kills the vibe.
It does.
It's like, again, one of the rules is that you're not supposed to talk about this so much. If a guy were to show up on a date and be like, hey, listen, I'm willing to commit 3 dates, 2 to 3 hours each. I'll take you out to dinner. The budget for each date is going to be, let's say, $150. I'll listen to your stories. I'll express interest in the person inside of your body. I will wait until you're comfortable. And in return, I ask that after you receive all that, I have access to your body. Like, good fucking luck with that, dude. That's never going to work. Now, so you can't be too explicit about the transaction at the core of sexual relationships because it makes everyone feel like prostitutes
Well, and
and
what you
tricks.
described is also not fun. Right? Where's the
It's
fun
not
in
fun.
that? Like, where's the playfulness?
Well, there's a lot of people don't like dating. They don't think
Yeah.
it's fun. Um,
Correct. Yeah. But if as long as you're sitting across from somebody, why not have a little give and take? Why not have a little bit of fun with the interaction? And that's not fun.
well, sure. And it's almost like you're supposed to not focus on the transaction. You're just supposed to have fun and be yourself and talk and get to know each other. And it's like they don't mention that while all this is going on, both parties are surreptitiously
Mhm.
observing and examining the other to say, like, is this a good option for me? Usually the
Absolutely.
woman examining the man more closely than the man is examining the woman. The man is probably just trying to get in her pants at that point.
Well, the man
Once he does
has
so, then he
already
starts to look more
examined her.
closely.
He wouldn't be sitting with her if she hadn't already passed his visual exam.
Visual exam, exactly. But the point is that for a lot of guys, they're not to blow the sexual opportunity. And they're not really vetting the women all too closely as
Mhm.
potential partners. I mean, that's one of the core reasons I imagine that you wrote your most recent book, Sean, Gatekeeper, is that so many men sort of abnegate their duty and their privilege to vet women for commitment and relationships.
Well, yeah, you and I have a similar message on that front. And I think you phrased it in the book as hire slow and fire fast, meaning if somebody's not a good fit, let's identify it quickly and move on and not waste everybody's time. That's the way I interpreted what you wrote.
Absolutely. It is not technically your responsibility not to waste somebody else's time. It's everybody's responsibility not to waste their own time.
Mhm.
But yeah, if you believe that a relationship isn't going to go where you want it to go, there's get out of there. Like, why invest more time and energy and resources into something that is going to be unsatisfying given your goals?
Yeah. So I, as I was reading the book, I thought about pastoral counselors, meaning counselors who are in the clergy who offer uh, premarital counseling. And it struck me that in that realm, there's actually some fairly open discussion about the transactional nature of the relationship because a big part of a relationship that's grounded in religion is shared values and the desire to build a particular type of family or join a particular type of community. It's very structured. And so I've noticed that pastoral counselors tend to be pretty uh, forthright about what exactly are we doing here? What are you getting from him and what are you getting from her? And I wonder, have you noticed that? And do you think it's a useful thing?
I haven't worked directly with a pastoral counselor, but I have talked to people who have gone through that process, and that matches with what I've heard. It does
Mhm.
seem to be pretty explicit, especially with respect to, let's say, the 5 or 6 topics that tend to be most problematic for married couples, which have to do with sex, money, in laws,
Mhm.
children, politics/religion. It's like those are the things that are very difficult to compromise on, and they become increasingly difficult as people's values or attitudes diverge.
Mhm.
So it's a very good idea to have all those hard conversations before you actually sign the contract, for sure. And I think that the value in a traditional marriage, that's the argument I kind of make at the end of the book, is that one of the reasons why I think marriage is going through a crisis is because we want it to be too many things. And that fundamentally and historically, marriage has been a very humble institution. And I define that as a safe and stable context in which to raise children. Like marriage was never supposed to be a romantic adventure with your soulmate. It wasn't supposed to be a close companionate relationship with your best friend. Like these are things that are very moving and touching to hear at wedding ceremonies, but might just be pouring fuel on the funeral pyre of marriages. It's like, because when we want our partner to be more and more things, we're just sort of increasing the likelihood that we're going to be disappointed. And a chain is kind of only as strong as its weakest link. And too often people will throw out the entire chain if one link tends to fail. And we know also that the value proposition in traditional Christian marriages is not symmetrical, as we can see in the traditional vows that men and women exchange at the altar. They don't say the same things. That's kind of a modern fad, is
Mhm.
for the man to say the same thing to the woman as the woman says to him, with the pronouns reversed. But that hasn't been the basis of enduring marriages throughout history, is that the man gives to the woman something different from what the woman gives to the man.
Let me read you something, another quote that you wrote, which is relevant here. In the
Okay.
context of sexual relationships, male commitment has been downgraded from a practical necessity to a personal preference. What you, is that relevant here? And what did you mean by it?
It's kind of relevant because I think the fundamental promise in the traditional marriage vows that men make is to like protect and provide and to forsake all others. And the women traditionally would say to love, honor, and obey. So they're kind of giving and offering different things in that traditional context. So historically, one of the things that men have offered women and that women have valued is provision, is resources. And this is especially salient in a time when women couldn't work even if they wanted to. Like they didn't, until very recently, they couldn't even own property. So it's like they kind of needed a man in order to have a life, to have a lifestyle, to have a house, to have anything. And it was either the father that they got those things from or their husband, because they couldn't really get them for themselves. Fast forward to 2024, and we now know that there isn't a significant income discrepancy between young, unmarried men and women. In fact, in many urban centers, childless women under 30 are out earning childless men under 30 for the very first time in human history. So women don't need men to provide in that way anymore. And one of the arguments I make in the book is that the primary driver of relationships throughout history has been necessity, because life has been very, very hard. And for the vast majority of history, most human beings that have lived more or less at a subsistence level. And when you're very close to that level, you have to send the strongest hunters out for food. And you have to make sure that the ones with the milk are with the children. Like you don't have margin of error as much when you're at the subsistence level. And so men and women tend to fall back on, let's say, more biologically determined gender roles. And they come together because that complementary skill set suggested by those biologically determined gender roles is really useful to survive. It's useful to raise children. It's useful as like a division of labor. And it's like, this is going to be very hard, but if we work together, we might be able to survive the winter. And if we have 10 kids, 7 of them might survive. And with those extra hands, we might be able to bring in a crop. It's like, that's why a lot of men and women got together. And when you eliminate necessity, you increase freedom. And everyone says freedom is a good thing. We definitely want more freedom and not less freedom. But it also reduces one of the drivers of relating to each other. And in the absence of necessity, desire becomes more and more important. Like, if I don't need you, I have to want you. And the less I need from you, the more I have to want you. And if I don't want you, I can do without you. You're not going to make my life any better. In fact, you're probably going to be a liability. So I have to really like you in order to relate to you if I don't need you.
So where does that leave a guy who's under 30 right now and a woman who's under 30?
Like, what should they do if they want long-term relationships?
What's the situation they face with each other, I guess? And
Well,
how does the guy respond to that?
One of the primary things that they're facing, and I don't think that as a culture we're fully aware of this yet, but the main thing that they're facing is that there's no small ponds anymore. It's like, it used to be enough that people could be relatively big fishes in small ponds, and they can win their little status hierarchies and secure, like, the quarterback gets the cheerleading captain kind of a thing. You know what I mean? That's a very small pond, and it's possible for those people to succeed in that hierarchy. There are no small ponds anymore. There's no ponds. Everyone is just swimming in one gigantic ocean that has been made possible through social media, in particular through Instagram. Where in today's day and age, it's not like everyone on the football team is competing, or everyone in the high school is competing for the cheerleading captain. It's like everyone in the world is potentially competing for the cheerleading captain. And it's not just everyone in the high school is competing for the quarterback. It's like every other woman on the planet is competing for the quarterback. It's very, very difficult. It's not enough to just be like reasonably attractive relative to your localized competition. Like, you have to be not just in the top 10% in your area, but like top 10% in the world, which is really very difficult. It's also made the optics of attractiveness change. Like, we saw this when television cameras were introduced to presidential debates. Like, the first time that happened, I think, was Nixon versus Kennedy. And Nixon doesn't look good on camera, man. He just got walloped. And ever since then, like, we haven't had ugly presidents. Like, it's very difficult to be physically unattractive and to run for a high profile position. Okay. The optics of the television camera have fundamentally changed politics. And you might argue, what does attractiveness have to do with being a good leader? And I would say, yeah, exactly. But that's the world in which we live. By the same token, the lens and the optics of social media has fundamentally changed how people present themselves and the game of mating and dating. And you might think, well, what does that have to do with being a good spouse or being a loving partner? And I would say, yeah, I don't know. But that's the world that we live in. If you don't pass that litmus test, it's going to be very difficult for you to get on the ballot.
So that's kind of a discouraging message for young men and young women, I think.
Can be.
Yeah.
It can also be an invitation. It's like, get good, in the sense of like, if this depends on being attractive to this degree, it's like, okay, well, you can sit down and lament your ability to ever attain that, or you can get to work. And I think it is harder to become attractive than a lot of people think. but it's also not static, especially with men. Like the top 10% of men does not stay constant from one decade to the next because so much of attractiveness from a female's perspective is men who are successful, high status, competent, and that's constantly changing, especially in a very socially mobile culture like America. 10 years ago, before I moved to San Francisco 13 years ago, I was living in public housing in Brooklyn. I didn't have like more than a few $100 to my name. I was not in the top 10% of men by any metric. And it took, 13 years of hard work to arrive to where I am today. But like, what's the alternative? I just get angry and join, echo chambers that resonate with my frustration. Like, that's not good for me, irrespective of whether I succeed in attracting women. So it's like, yeah, it's hard, but maybe it's a how bad do you want it challenge.
Yeah, fair enough. There's also the question of proximity, where a given woman in a given location may have many people all over the internet interested in her, but they don't all have physical access to her. They're not all in her physical environment and have the
Doesn't
opportunity
matter.
to it doesn't matter. What do you mean?
Not as much because you can just put her on a plane. Like if you're really a successful man, you can cherry pick the most beautiful women from all over the world and you can just buy them a plane ticket to come and visit you.
Provided they're willing to go.
Yeah, I would say that if the man is sufficiently attractive, they're willing to go. They might
Okay.
not be willing to go right away. Maybe you'll have to have a phone conversation with them first or some side of video chat. But like most women, if they're not finding what they want immediately around them, and a lot of women complain about that, they're willing to look further and further afield, especially if it just comes at, the cost of the attempt, if the guy's footing the bill.
Okay. Well, I guess I'm trying to inject a bit of optimism here, but realistic optimism. Like I don't believe in blowing smoke because that just hurts people. But say you have a guy who's working at a grocery store. There's a checker, young guy. He's 22 or whatever. There's a checker. She's 20. Elon Musk is, maybe she's attractive, but Elon Musk isn't going to fly her out to California. That kid has access to that girl. He can talk to her. And yes, she may be on Instagram. She may be getting attention online, but not everyone online is going to say, "Hey, let me fly out to Florida. Let me fly out to Barcelona. Let me fly you to Moscow." There are some limits that we can operate within where there is some opportunity. Whereas you say, if you get good, if you have some um, if you have some qualities that women look for, if you know how to build those qualities, then you can have a conversation with that young lady.
You certainly
Is that
can.
unreasonable to inject a little bit of optimism here?
No, I mean, you should always shoot your shot, because you don't really understand how the other party perceives you. I talk about that in chapter 3 about sexual marketplace values. What's really important to understand about that is SMV is always perceived, and so it exists in the mind of the perceiver. And people can and do deviate significantly from, let's say, the normalized sexual marketplace value of what our culture says that we should hold up as the archetypes of male and female attractiveness. So you should shoot your shot and not assume that you know how the other person feels about you. Like force the other person to reject you. That's one of my guiding principles.
Mhm.
Don't reject yourself. Force them to reject you.
That's
Now,
very well said. I like that.
cool. Now, if I was giving advice to this 20-year-old checker, like you have to have some kind of riz though,
Mhm.
because you have access to the girl. That's an opportunity. You got to be funny. You got
Mhm.
to be charming.
Mhm.
You got to like potentially play the long game. People do tend to fall in love with what they see repeatedly.
Mhm.
I think the psychological term for that is the mere exposure hypothesis. And it's kind of what drives so much of advertising is that if you have two options, one of which you've heard before, another which you didn't, you'll probably prefer the one that you've heard before to the one that you haven't. And so just like being familiar with a person, just like seeing them over and over again, is probably going to make you feel more positively disposed towards them.
Mm-hmm.
That said, that guy is going to have to compensate that woman in other ways because he's a checker. Like he's not going to be able to take her out to fancy dinners. He's not going to be able to provide an emotionally compelling lifestyle. He'll have to like potentially bank on his vision of the future
Mm-hmm.
and show that woman that he is sufficiently invested in that vision that he's working diligently towards its attainment. Otherwise, he's just future faking, which of course does work, and men do that as well.
Yes, it does work up to a point.
Up to a point.
The truth
Eventually,
always
the
comes
woman's
out.
going to be like, okay, I've been waiting around for this future for a while and it hasn't showed up yet.
Yeah.
And they generally leave in a huff.
Yeah. Well, because they've been misled.
Yeah, oh, sure. Yeah.
In nature,
And of course, they've been complicit in being misled. You know,
Sure.
it's like, why did you believe the liar? Did you want to believe the liar?
Yeah. Did you
Why
want
did
to
you
believe?
want to
Did you
believe the
lack
liar?
skills? Did you lack insight? Did you lack education? Okay, let's get a little smarter next time.
Exactly. Yeah. Like everyone gets burnt once,
Yeah.
like the question, or twice. The question is, how many are you getting burned the same way over and over again? And you haven't learned your lesson.
Yeah. And this is not particular to humans. In nature, there are honest and dishonest indicators of fitness. You know, like a dishonest indicator is the fiddler crab that loses a pincher and then it grows one back that is bigger and more formidable looking, but it's weaker. It's fragile. So it's a
Oh.
dishonest signal. An honest signal would be a peacock's tail because a peacock has to be healthy and it has to be virile to generate an impressive tail. That's something that cannot be faked. And so I guess one of the responsibilities of women is to learn the honest and the dishonest signals from men.
Yeah. I just finished an episode called A PhD in Men. And I do highly suggest that women at least take some sort of course of study to understand men.
Mm-hmm.
There's definitely a subclass of men out there who make it their life's work to understand the operation of women. They often do it just to get laid.
Mm-hmm.
They do it to get what they want. But like men, I think on the whole are much more interested in figuring out how women tick than the other way around. And I think that leaves women vulnerable to, let's say, bad actors in the market, which there always will be. And it's not just humans, as you say. It's an evolved strategy for survival and reproduction in any animal species.
Yeah. Let me throw a different question at you. You had a chapter on love. I forgot what this chapter. It's called "Love Has Nothing to Do with Relationships." Is the name of the chapter. And you started off with a Zen koan, and this is the Zen koan is something that's supposed to make you really stop and think, as I understand it. I'm not a Buddhist, but the koan goes like this: What is the most valuable thing in the world? So, do you remember the answer that you put in the book?
Yes, it's an old Zen koan, and the answer is the most valuable thing in the world is the head of a dead cat.
And why is that?
Because no one can name its price.
So, what do you want people to take away from this chapter on love, and why did you include that koan?
It's very important, that chapter. I think it's also the best written chapter in the book. It's my personal favorite chapter because it also proactively addresses what I think is the most plausible sounding criticism of the economic model, which is it's just so mercenary and transactional. What about love? What about friendship? What about loyalty? What about all the beautiful, noble things that make it worthwhile to relate to each other? I don't want to pretend that those things don't exist. And so how do those things fit into this model of relationships? And so I think it's absolutely an essential chapter in the book.
So,
One of the go ahead.
No, go ahead.
So with respect to the koan, which I think also speaks to the title of the book, The Value of Others, is that you can approach a lot of these ideas from more than one perspective. And I think that we often err on the side of thinking of love as this rare and precious jewel, which it is. But it's not only that, because it's a good thing that's not only that, because if love is only this rare and precious jewel, it's probably going to be very expensive and beyond the means of most people to purchase. You know, so to continue the jewel metaphor, maybe you're aware of this, Sean, but like it came out a while ago that diamonds aren't as rare as most people think.
Right. Yeah.
And it turns out that a lot of diamond merchants are kind of in cahoots with each other. They have huge stockpiles of the
Yeah.
gems, but they keep them off the market because if they were more readily available, they would lower the price.
Yeah, and
Right.
I remember noticing this in my 20s. At every mall I went, there was 10 million diamonds all over the place, but we treat them like they're anyway, go ahead.
So we can talk about something like this exquisite diamond. The Hope diamond is priceless because like no one, all the money in the world would not be enough to buy it. We can put it that way. But another way of viewing pricelessness is that no one would even buy it for a penny. Like the same things that can't be bought are not in the marketplace, just like the things that can't be sold. The things that can't be sold are just as valueless as the things that can't be bought. All the money in the world couldn't purchase the one, and not even a single cent could purchase the other. So, on some level, those two things have come full circle. So, with respect to love, we can think about it like this rare and precious jewel, which it is, but we can also think about it as like a very common commodity, something that's so common that no one would ever think to buy it.
Mhm.
And I think that might actually be a more useful way of thinking about love, that it's actually so abundant that it's valueless. And I talk about how all of these great things like love and loyalty and friendship, I call them non transactable goods. And the good news about that is you don't need a relationship for these things. Like if you only needed a relationship, if you needed a relationship to love, well, how cruel would that be given the fact that so many people lack relationships? Are we saying that these people are just incapable of loving or they cannot feel love in their lives? That's awful. So I think that we have a very incorrect idea of what love is, which I try to correct in part in that chapter in the book. But that love is something that comes out of you, the lover, and you don't actually need to be in a relationship with somebody else to do it. And that's, I think, the context in which some spiritual teachings begin to make sense. Like when Jesus tells us to love our enemies, he's not saying be in a relationship with our enemies. I don't think so. He's certainly not saying to feel positively and good about the fact that people hate you.
How
I
do you
think,
interpret that phrase?
um, well, I think that I define love in the book as the humiliated self exultant, which is basically like I'm going to sacrifice my own needs for the good of the other. And you can even do that for those who hate you. And I think that's what Jesus exemplifies in his mortification. It's like as the people are pounding the nails into the cross, he's praying that God forgive them. Like he's wishing good for those who want to kill him. Like that's love. And it's not just a feeling, he was acting as best as he can when in the circumstances that he was under to secure the good of the other, even though that person was paying him with, incredible harm. So we don't need to be in relationships to love. And love is an abundant, limitless resource that we can tap into in our own hearts and sort of channel it out to others, irrespective of whether they give us what we want, irrespective of whether they give us what we need, irrespective of whether they even know that we exist at all. Otherwise, everything is about religion and spirituality doesn't really make any sense. Like, how do you have love and kindness meditations for people all over the world? Like Buddhists like to meditate on how may all beings be free of suffering. I think that's love. And it's not like that person is actually in a relationship with every human being unless you're at that transpersonal level of reality. I'm getting a little up there, so maybe we need to pull it back down.
Well, but I can pull it back down by mentioning that in that chapter you talk about altruism, which I take to mean love that is acted out. It doesn't just exist in your head. It's actually doing something for somebody
Mhm.
without, I suppose, by definition, without the expectation of being of compensation.
Sure. I mean, if otherwise it would just be a covert contract and we were giving to get, which we wouldn't call altruism at all. So, on some level, one of the truest tests of love and altruism is, do you enact it even in the absence of a relationship? Like, if you just love until the relationship is over, did you really love that person? Like, why does your love stop when you stop getting what you wanted? In most cases, we're not really talking about love. We're talking about a positive feeling of getting our needs and wants gratified by another human being. And of course, when that stops, our feeling starts to shift.
Yeah.
But
So
like, love doesn't depend on getting what we want. Love has nothing to do with getting what we want. It's about giving the other person what they need.
you wrote in when you're discussing altruism, you wrote about the rampant hypocrisy of pretending to be altruistic when what's really going on is a desire to do business. So left me wondering, how do we know the difference within ourselves? Forget about other people. How do I know if I'm actually being altruistic or if I'm trying to get something?
I don't know if you
Mm.
ever truly know. Like, it can be very difficult to suss that out. And so I guess my response would be, don't even think about it. Like, as best as you can, if that's something that you're concerned about, just focus on doing the good. Just focus on serving other people, and it will fall where it lies.
Mhm.
Like, I've heard it said that certain virtues kind of have a, let's call it a guardianship to them that prevent people who have them from knowing that they have them. Like, the truly humble don't even know that they're humble. And that's probably a guardianship, because if they knew, that could be a trap for pride about how humble they were. So, truly humble people don't think about, am I humble? Am I really expressing humility in this? They're just trying to make themselves the proper size and put other people ahead of themselves. And to the extent that they succeed in doing that, their virtue increases, but it's not important so much for them to know that. That would be my rebuttal.
Yeah. And I suppose on the flip side of that, truly stupid people don't know that they're stupid. They just go about their stupid lives doing stupid things.
It
They don't
certainly
question.
seems that way.
I don't know. Maybe I went too far with that. But um, on a lighter note here, just wrapping it up, there's a lot of nautical imagery in the book. You talk about being the captain of your ship versus being a passenger. You throughout the book, you talk about things like mutiny, about being trapped at the water's edge. You talked about doldrums and trade winds. What draws you to this imagery?
That's a good question, because I don't really have a lot of experience with boats. I've only been sailing a couple of times. Um, I don't even live near the water anymore. For some reason, that is the extended metaphor that came to me over the years as I was attempting to explain some of the realities of the sexual marketplace to my clients and my patients. I don't know where that came from. But it seemed, the more I went into that analogy, the more apt it was to describe what I was seeing in the modern game of mating and dating. I think it's really useful to talk in metaphor and parable, because these things can be made true to everybody. The more concrete you are with your description, the easier it is for someone to say, oh, I've never felt that, or I've never experienced that, or that doesn't apply to me. And then they'll just dismiss anything that follows because it doesn't exactly match their own concrete lived experience. But the benefit of talking in metaphor or parable is that it can be true on so many different levels of comprehension simultaneously, and that people are going to adapt the metaphor to their lived experience. So they're going to like try to make it work, and it will work to the extent that they make it work. and then they'll get what they can out of the metaphor. And the more that they can make it work, the more they'll get out of it, because metaphors and parables, like I said, are true on multiple levels of comprehension simultaneously. The the only downside to parable and metaphor is that people can sometimes take them too literally. And that's certainly a danger in religion. Like Jesus mostly talked in parables in the New Testament. And we see what can happen when people take a lot of things that are meant as a spiritual metaphor with too much concreteness and literalness. I think that leads to suboptimal outcomes.
Yeah, I agree, and I think it's a metaphor that works. And I guess when I think about this nautical imagery, I think about a boat that or a ship that is plunked down in the middle of the ocean, and it can go anywhere it wants. And that's your life. It can go anywhere it wants unless it gets hijacked from within or from without. And if you are fortunate enough to be born in Western society in this day and age, there's a very good chance that you have a lot of latitude in where you take your ship. And I guess
Yeah,
that's
I
why that
also like it
spoke.
because it seems enduring. Like very few people actually engage with ships anymore. Most people are flying or driving.
Mhm.
So there's something kind of like deeply historical about nautical imagery. Like it feels like it takes us back through thousands of years of history in a way that making metaphors about airplanes probably wouldn't. So it using that metaphor also suggests that we're talking about something that's more cross-culturally true or
Mhm.
true throughout time, because ships have existed so much longer than other forms of transportation.
Yeah, it's compelling imagery. So, Orion, what else is important to know about this book, The Value of Others?
Hmm. What's important to know. It is a little. It's not something that you could probably read casually. That's something that I should just put out there. Either listen to casually or read casually. I think it's one of those books you might have to pay attention to. I think it's one of those books you might have to read or listen to more than once. And I think that was by design. It's a different medium than my YouTube channel. On YouTube, you can be a bit more, let's say, democratic. It's like it's a different platform and it's engaging with a different kind of audience. This is a book. This is something that can the purpose of this book when I wrote it is I want this to be as relevant 100 years from now as it is today. And so I wanted to talk about enduring truths as I saw them in the sexual marketplace. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're always going to be easy or immediately understandable.
Mhm.
That said, I do firmly believe that it's worth making the effort to understand some of these principles.
Well, yeah, I appreciate you talking to me about it. It's a good book. I think everybody should read it. And yeah, I guess we could leave it there. And
Thanks, Sean.
yeah,
This was great, man. I really appreciate our friendship. We've known each other for several years now, and I've read a number of your books over the years, and it's been really wonderful to have this connection. It's been a very meaningful relationship for me, and for the viewers out there, your wife did so much work on the book. I thank her in the acknowledgments, but she's the one who helped me design the cover and also the beautiful typesetting of the actual text. The book looks great, and that's in large part because of your wife's efforts. So thank you.
she's very talented. So thank you. And I also appreciate our friendship and these conversations. And let's do it again. This is enjoyable.
Right on, man. Yeah,
Yeah.
anytime.
Okay. And congratulations. It's really quite an accomplishment. And yeah, you should be proud of it.
Already thinking about the next one. Can't wait to get started.
There you go. All right, my man. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, Sean.